There is something quietly fascinating about missions that are both familiar and completely new at the same time, and that is exactly where NASA's Artemis 2 sits. Not quite the unknown chaos of the early space race, but not the routine, almost procedural nature of later orbital flights either. Instead, it exists in a kind of in-between space, a return, but also a first step into something we have not fully experienced before. And tonight, as you settle in, whether you're listening from a quiet bedroom, a late-night drive, or somewhere halfway across the world, take a moment to let me know where you are. It's always interesting to see how far these conversations travel. And if you find yourself drawn into these deeper explorations of space, patterns, and the unknown, consider subscribing, because this is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Now, on the surface, Artemis 2 is simple to explain. It is the first crewed mission in NASA's Artemis program, designed to send astronauts around the moon and safely back to Earth. No landing, no dramatic surface operations, just a looping trajectory, a proving ground for systems, and a symbolic return to lunar orbit for the first time since the era of Apollo program. That's the official story, and in many ways, it is accurate. After decades of low Earth orbit missions aboard the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station, Artemis 2 represents the next logical step outward. A test of the spacecraft, the rocket, and the human ability to operate beyond the protective cocoon of Earth's immediate environment. But if you slow down and look more carefully, certain details begin to stand out. Not in a dramatic or conspiratorial way, but in a quiet, analytical sense. The kind that makes you pause and ask, why this way? And why now? Because returning to the moon is not a new idea. It has been proposed, delayed, reshaped, and rebranded for decades. Programs have come and gone, budgets have shifted, priorities have changed. Yet Artemis 2 is happening now, in this particular configuration, with this specific architecture. And that raises interesting questions about what has changed and what hasn't. The spacecraft itself, known as Orion spacecraft, is often described as the modern successor to Apollo's command module. And in many ways, it is. It carries a crew, it separates from its launch vehicle, and it travels into deep space before returning through Earth's atmosphere. But Orion is also fundamentally different. It is larger, more automated, and built for longer missions. It is designed not just for a single trip, but as part of a system, one that includes future lunar gateways, surface missions, and potentially even Mars expeditions. So Artemis 2 is not just testing a spacecraft, it is testing a philosophy of exploration that is more modular, more sustained, and arguably more complex than anything attempted during Apollo. And then there is the rocket. The Space Launch System, or SLS, is often described as the most powerful rocket ever built. Again, that is technically true. But it is also one of the most debated components of the entire program. Its development has been long, expensive, and closely tied to legacy technologies from the Space Shuttle era. Some see this as a strength, a proven foundation. Others see it as a limitation, a sign that the system is anchored in the past rather than fully embracing newer, potentially more efficient approaches. And this tension between old and new runs through almost every aspect of Artemis 2. From a mainstream perspective, the mission is about safety and validation. Before sending astronauts to land on the moon again, NASA needs to ensure that Orion can support human life in deep space, that its heat shield can withstand re-entry at lunar return velocities, and that its navigation systems function correctly over vast distances. Artemis 1, the uncrewed test flight, already provided a significant amount of data. Artemis 2 builds on that by adding the most unpredictable variable, humans. Their presence changes everything. Systems must be more reliable, procedures more refined, contingencies more robust. But here is where things become quietly interesting. Because if Artemis 2 is just a test flight, why does it carry so much symbolic weight? Why is it being positioned not just as a technical milestone, but as a cultural and historical moment? Part of the answer lies in timing. We are in a period where multiple nations and private companies are accelerating their space ambitions. The moon is no longer just a destination, it is becoming a strategic point of interest. Resources, positioning, long-term presence. These ideas are being discussed more openly than they were even a decade ago. And so, Artemis 2 can also be viewed as a signal, not in a dramatic, confrontational sense, but as a quiet statement. We are returning, we are capable, and we are preparing for something more sustained. It is a demonstration of capability, yes, but also of intent. And intent, in the context of space exploration, often reveals more than the mission profile itself. There are also subtler details. The trajectory Artemis 2 will take is not identical to Apollo missions. It incorporates modern understanding of orbital mechanics, fuel efficiency, and mission flexibility. It allows for extended time in deep space, testing not just the hardware, but the human experience of traveling beyond Earth orbit for longer durations. This might seem like a minor technical adjustment, but it hints at future missions that will go further, stay longer, and operate with greater independence from Earth. Then there is the crew selection. While we won't go into specific names here, the composition of the Artemis 2 crew has been carefully considered. It reflects not just technical expertise, but also a broader representation of humanity. This is often framed as progress, and it is, but it also serves another function. It reshapes the narrative of space exploration from a national competition into something more global, more inclusive. And that shift in narrative can influence how future missions are perceived, funded, and supported. Now, none of this suggests anything hidden or secret in the traditional sense. There is no need to jump to conclusions or assume unknown agendas. But it does highlight a pattern, a layering of purposes. On one level, Artemis 2 is exactly what it appears to be, a crude test flight around the moon. On another level, it is part of a broader transition in how we approach space, moving from short, isolated missions to long-term presence and infrastructure. And when you look at it that way, small questions begin to emerge. If this is only the second step in a long sequence, how much of the final destination is already decided? How much of the architecture we see now is temporary, and how much is laying the foundation for something much larger? And perhaps most interesting of all, what are the constraints that shape these decisions? Because every design choice, every timeline, every delay, they all leave traces of the forces behind them, whether those forces are technological, economic, or something less obvious. As we continue, we'll take a closer look at those forces, not by assuming answers, but by examining the patterns they leave behind, the timelines, the design decisions, the moments where plans change direction. Because Artemis 2 is not just a mission, it is a point in a much longer story, one that stretches back to Apollo and forward into something we are only beginning to define. If you trace the story of Artemis 2 just a little further back, the picture begins to widen in a way that feels less like a single mission, and more like a long, slow recalibration of how humanity approaches deep space. Because Artemis 2 did not emerge in isolation. It is the result of decades of shifting priorities, cancelled programs, evolving technologies, and, perhaps most importantly, changing expectations about what space exploration is supposed to achieve. And when you start to follow that thread carefully, you begin to notice something subtle. The path back to the moon has not been a straight line. It has been a series of pauses, detours, and quiet resets. After the final missions of the Apollo program, there was a sense, at least publicly, that the moon had been, in some way, completed. Not fully understood, not fully explored, but sufficiently visited to justify moving on. The focus shifted to low Earth orbit, to the development of reusable spacecraft, and eventually to long-duration habitation aboard stations like the International Space Station. From a practical standpoint, this made sense. It allowed for sustained research, international collaboration, and the gradual refinement of life support systems in microgravity. But it also created a kind of boundary, an invisible line that human spaceflight did not cross for decades. And that boundary is important, because Artemis 2 is not just crossing physical distance, it is crossing that historical line for the first time in over half a century. And when something remains untouched for that long, the question is not just, can we go back, but why didn't we sooner? The mainstream explanation usually points to cost, risk, and shifting political priorities. All valid reasons. The Apollo missions were extraordinarily expensive, and once the geopolitical urgency of the Cold War began to ease, the incentive to continue lunar missions diminished. But if you examine the timeline more closely, you'll notice that the idea of returning to the moon never truly disappeared. It resurfaced repeatedly under different names and frameworks. There was the Space Exploration Initiative in the late 1980s, which proposed a return to the moon and a journey to Mars. Then came the Constellation program in the early 2000s, which aimed to develop new rockets and spacecraft for lunar missions. Each time, the plans were ambitious, and each time, they were ultimately scaled back or cancelled. From a straightforward perspective, this pattern reflects the complexity of large-scale space programs. Budgets fluctuate, administrations change, and technical challenges emerge. But there is also something else embedded in that pattern, a kind of hesitation, not an inability, but a reluctance to commit fully, almost as if the goal of returning to the moon has always been just within reach, yet consistently deferred. And this is where Artemis 2 becomes particularly interesting. Because unlike its predecessors, it is not starting from a blank slate. It is inheriting elements from past programs, technologies, designs, even institutional knowledge, and integrating them into a new framework. The Space Launch System, for example, draws heavily from space shuttle components. The Orion spacecraft began development under the Constellation program before being adapted for Artemis. In a sense, Artemis 2 is less of a fresh beginning and more of a continuation, a convergence of multiple unfinished paths. And that convergence raises a subtle but important question. Is Artemis 2 the result of a clear, long-term vision finally coming together? Or is it a carefully assembled compromise, shaped by the constraints of what came before? The answer is likely somewhere in between. But understanding that balance can change how we interpret the mission itself. For instance, consider the pacing of the Artemis program. Artemis 1 launched as an uncrewed test, demonstrating that the core systems could function in deep space. Artemis 2 introduces a crew but stops short of landing. Artemis 3 is planned to attempt a lunar landing, but it relies on additional systems that are still in development, including human landing vehicles provided by commercial partners. This step-by-step approach is often described as cautious and methodical, and it is. But it also reflects a layered dependency, where each mission builds on the previous one, and delays in one area can ripple through the entire timeline. Now, from a purely technical standpoint, this makes sense. Space exploration is inherently risky, and incremental testing reduces the likelihood of catastrophic failure. But from a broader perspective, it also suggests that the architecture of Artemis is not entirely fixed. It is still evolving, still adapting to new inputs, new technologies, and perhaps new priorities that are not always visible at the surface level. Another detail worth noticing is the growing role of private companies in the Artemis framework. Unlike the Apollo era, where missions were almost entirely government-driven, Artemis involves partnerships with multiple commercial entities. These companies are responsible for key components, including landers and support systems. On one hand, this introduces innovation and flexibility. On the other, it adds layers of coordination and dependency that did not exist before. So Artemis 2, while presented as a standalone mission, is actually part of a much more interconnected system. It is testing not just hardware, but relationships between agencies, companies, and even nations. Because the Artemis program also includes international partners, contributing modules, technology, and expertise. This transforms the mission from a national effort into something closer to a global project. And here, the pattern becomes even more interesting. Because when multiple stakeholders are involved, decisions are rarely driven by a single objective. They are shaped by negotiation, compromise, and long-term alignment of interests. This does not make the mission less scientific or less genuine. It simply adds another layer of complexity. A layer that can influence timelines, priorities, and even the way success is defined. If we return to Artemis 2 itself, its role begins to feel slightly different in this context. Yes, it is a test of life support systems, navigation, and human performance in deep space, but it is also a demonstration that this new, more complex model of exploration can function. That a mission involving legacy technology, modern spacecraft, commercial partnerships, and international collaboration can come together and operate as a coherent whole. And perhaps that is one of the quieter secrets of Artemis 2. Not something hidden, but something easy to overlook. The mission is not just about reaching the moon's orbit, it is about proving that a new way of reaching it is viable. A way that is less centralized, more distributed, and potentially more sustainable over the long term. Of course, this raises further questions. If this model works, how will it evolve? Will future missions become even more decentralized? Will the balance between government and private control shift further? And how might that influence the ultimate goals of lunar exploration? Whether those goals are scientific, economic, or something that sits somewhere in between. For now, Artemis 2 remains a step, a carefully measured movement outward, carrying with it the weight of past ambitions and the uncertainty of future ones. And as we continue, we'll begin to look more closely at the technology itself, not just what it does, but how its design choices reveal deeper priorities and constraints that shape the mission in ways that are not always immediately obvious. When you begin to look closely at the technology behind Artemis 2, something subtle starts to emerge, not in the form of hidden features or dramatic unknowns, but in the quiet logic of design decisions. Because every spacecraft, every system, every material choice is the result of trade-offs. Weight versus durability. Automation versus human control. Redundancy versus efficiency. And if you examine those trade-offs carefully, they begin to tell a story, not just about engineering, but about priorities, assumptions, and even expectations about the future. Take the Orion spacecraft, for example. On the surface, it is presented as a modern evolution of earlier crew capsules. It is designed to carry astronauts beyond low Earth orbit, sustain them for extended periods, and bring them safely back through Earth's atmosphere. That is the official description, and it is accurate. But when you look at Orion in detail, you notice that it is not optimized for everything. It is not the most spacious spacecraft ever designed. It is not fully reusable in the way the space shuttle was intended to be. And it is not designed to land on the moon itself. Instead, it is highly specialized, almost deliberately constrained. From a mainstream perspective, this specialization is practical. Orion is built for deep space travel, where reliability matters more than flexibility. A capsule design is inherently safer during re-entry, and limiting its functions reduces complexity. But there is another way to look at it. By narrowing the role of Orion, the overall mission architecture becomes more modular. Different vehicles handle different tasks. Orion transports crew, other systems handle landing, others provide long-term habitation. This separation can increase efficiency, but it also introduces dependencies. Each piece must function correctly, and the integration between them becomes just as important as the performance of any single component. And that brings us to an interesting detail: Orion's life support systems. These are designed to support a crew for a limited duration, not indefinitely. Artemis 2 itself is planned as a relatively short mission, on the order of days, not weeks or months. This makes sense for a test flight, but it also raises a question: how much of Orion's design is focused on this mission specifically, and how much is intended for longer-term use? Because if future missions require extended stays in deep space, additional systems or entirely different modules will be needed. Now, this is not unusual in engineering. Systems are often designed for specific roles. But in the context of Artemis, it reinforces the idea that Orion is one piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that is still being assembled. And that means Artemis 2 is not just testing Orion in isolation. It is testing how well this piece fits into the broader structure that is still taking shape. Then, there is the Space Launch System, which carries Orion into space. From a purely technical standpoint, SLS is an extraordinary machine. Its thrust, its scale, its ability to send heavy payloads beyond Earth orbit. All of these are significant achievements, but its design also reflects a series of decisions that are worth examining more closely. SLS relies heavily on components derived from the Space Shuttle program, including its engines and solid rocket boosters. This has often been described as a way to leverage proven technology, reducing risk and development time, and there is truth to that. But it also ties the system to older design philosophies, ones that were developed under very different conditions, with different goals in mind. The Space Shuttle was designed for frequent, reusable missions to low Earth orbit. SLS, by contrast, is designed for infrequent, high-power launches into deep space. So the question becomes, does adapting older technology for a new purpose introduce limitations that are not immediately obvious? Or does it provide a level of reliability that newer systems have yet to prove? Again, there is no single answer, but the tension between innovation and continuity is clearly visible here. And Artemis 2 sits right at the center of that tension. Another detail that often goes unnoticed is the way Orion interacts with its European-built service module, provided by European Space Agency. This module supplies propulsion, power, and life support resources during the mission. On one level, this is a straightforward example of international collaboration. Different agencies contribute different components, sharing both the workload and the benefits. But on another level, it introduces a layer of interdependence that did not exist in earlier programs like Apollo. The success of the mission depends not just on one organization, but on the seamless integration of multiple systems developed across different regions, cultures, and engineering approaches. This is a powerful model for future exploration, but it also requires a level of coordination that is inherently complex. And complexity in spaceflight is always something to watch carefully. Not because it implies failure, but because it creates more points where things must align perfectly. Artemis 2, in this sense, is as much a test of coordination as it is of hardware. If you step back for a moment, a pattern begins to form. Orion is specialized. SLS is powerful, but rooted in legacy design. The service module is international. The overall architecture is modular and interdependent. None of these elements are unusual on their own, but together they suggest a deliberate shift away from the more self-contained approach of earlier missions. During the Apollo era, a single rocket launched a relatively self-sufficient system that carried astronauts to the moon, landed them, and brought them back. It was complex, but it was also integrated in a very direct way. Artemis, by contrast, spreads that functionality across multiple systems, each with its own role, its own development timeline, and its own set of constraints. From a mainstream perspective, this reflects progress. Modern missions are more flexible, more scalable, and better suited for long-term exploration. But it also raises a quieter question. Does increasing modularity make missions more resilient, or does it make them more dependent on perfect alignment between many moving parts? Artemis 2 does not answer that question directly, but it begins to explore it. By sending humans into deep space using this new architecture, it tests not just whether each component works, but whether the system as a whole can function as intended. And there is one more layer to consider: automation. Modern spacecraft rely heavily on automated systems for navigation, life support, and anomaly detection. Orion is no exception. It is designed to operate with a high degree of autonomy, reducing the workload on the crew and increasing overall safety. But automation also changes the role of the astronaut. Instead of directly controlling every aspect of the mission, the crew becomes more of a supervisor, monitoring systems and intervening when necessary. This shift is subtle but significant. It reflects a broader trend in technology, where human involvement becomes more strategic and less hands-on. And in the context of deep space missions, it raises interesting questions about trust. How much do we rely on automated systems, and how do we verify that they are functioning correctly in an environment where immediate intervention from Earth is not possible? So, as Artemis 2 moves forward, it carries with it more than just astronauts and equipment. It carries a set of assumptions about how space exploration should be conducted in the coming decades. Assumptions about modularity, collaboration, automation, and the balance between old and new technologies. And as we continue, we'll begin to look at the human side of this mission. Not just who the astronauts are, but what their presence reveals about risk, perception, and the evolving role of humans in an increasingly automated journey into deep space. As Artemis 2 moves from hardware and design into something more human, the perspective shifts in a subtle but meaningful way. Because no matter how advanced the systems become, the presence of astronauts changes the nature of the mission entirely. It introduces variables that cannot be fully simulated, responses that cannot be entirely predicted, and perhaps most interesting of all, a psychological dimension that often receives less attention than it deserves. And when you look closely, Artemis 2 is not just testing whether humans can survive in deep space again. It is testing how they adapt to returning after such a long absence. From a mainstream point of view, human spaceflight is built on decades of experience. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station have spent months, even close to a year, in microgravity. Procedures for life support, communication, and emergency response have been refined over time. Training programs are extensive, covering everything from spacecraft systems to physical conditioning. So in theory, sending a crew around the moon should not introduce entirely new challenges, only a different environment. But that different environment is where things begin to shift. Low Earth orbit, where the ISS operates, is still within Earth's protective magnetic field. It shields astronauts from a significant portion of cosmic radiation. Communication with Earth is nearly continuous, with only brief interruptions. And in an emergency, a return to Earth can be initiated relatively quickly. Deep space, even at the distance of the Moon, is not the same. Once Orion moves beyond that protective boundary, the crew enters an environment where radiation exposure increases, communication delays become noticeable, and the psychological sense of distance becomes more pronounced. These are not unknown factors. They were encountered during the Apollo program, but they have not been experienced by humans for over 50 years. And that gap matters, not because knowledge has been lost, but because direct experience has not been continuous. So Artemis 2 becomes, in part, a relearning process, a way to validate that the assumptions we carry forward from Apollo still hold true under modern conditions. Because even if the physics has not changed, the context has. Modern astronauts are trained differently. They rely more on digital systems, more on automation, more on continuous data streams from Earth. Removing or limiting those elements, even slightly, changes how decisions are made. And this leads to an interesting question. How much autonomy will the crew actually have? Officially, Orion is designed to operate with a high degree of automation, as we explored earlier. But in deep space, where communication delays can reach several seconds each way, real-time control from Earth becomes less practical. This means the crew must be capable of handling unexpected situations independently, at least for short periods. From a practical standpoint, this is built into their training. Astronauts are prepared for contingencies, for system failures, for scenarios where immediate guidance is not available. But there is a difference between training for autonomy and experiencing it in real conditions, with the knowledge that you are farther from Earth than any human has been in generations. And that psychological shift is difficult to quantify. During Apollo missions, astronauts often described a sense of isolation, but also a profound perspective, seeing Earth as a distant, fragile sphere. This experience has been discussed extensively, sometimes referred to as the overview effect. It is often framed as transformative, even philosophical, but it also carries a quieter implication that being in deep space changes not just how you see Earth, but how you perceive your own role within the mission. In the context of Artemis 2, this raises another subtle point. The mission is not a race. It is not driven by the same geopolitical urgency that defined Apollo. Instead, it is part of a long-term program with multiple stakeholders and objectives. So the crew's role is slightly different. They are not just explorers or representatives of a single nation. They are participants in a broader system, one that includes international partners, commercial entities, and future missions that depend on their success. This can influence how risk is perceived. In Apollo, risk was often accepted as a necessary part of achieving a clear, immediate goal. Today, risk is managed more conservatively, with an emphasis on sustainability and long-term viability. Artemis 2 reflects this shift. It is designed to test systems thoroughly before committing to more complex missions, like landing on the Moon again. But even with this cautious approach, the presence of humans introduces unpredictability. Not in a negative sense, but in a fundamental one. Humans adapt, improvise, and sometimes respond in ways that systems cannot anticipate. This is both a strength and a challenge. It allows for flexibility, but it also requires systems to accommodate a wider range of possibilities. Another aspect that often goes unnoticed is how the crew interacts with the spacecraft itself. Orion is designed to be highly automated, but it still provides manual controls and interfaces for the astronauts. This dual-mode operation, automated and manual, creates an interesting dynamic. The crew must trust the systems, but also remain ready to override them if necessary. And trust, in this context, is not just a technical issue. It is psychological. How much do you rely on automation when you are days away from Earth? How do you balance confidence in the system with vigilance for potential anomalies? These are questions that cannot be fully answered through simulation alone. They require real missions, real conditions, and real human responses. If you step back again, Artemis 2 begins to look less like a simple test flight and more like a bridge, a transition between two eras of human spaceflight. On one side, the hands-on, high-risk exploration of Apollo. On the other, a more distributed, automated, and collaborative approach to deep space missions. The astronauts aboard Artemis 2 are, in a sense, navigating that transition, not just physically, but operationally and psychologically. And there is one more layer to consider: perception from Earth. Public interest in space exploration has evolved over time. During Apollo, missions were followed with intense attention, driven by a sense of competition and national pride. Today, the landscape is more fragmented. There are more missions, more players, and more information available. Artemis 2 must capture attention in a different way, not through urgency, but through relevance. This influences how the mission is presented, how the crew is introduced, and how their journey is communicated to the public. It becomes not just a technical achievement, but a narrative, one that connects past exploration with future possibilities. And narratives, while grounded in fact, are shaped by choices about what to emphasize and what to leave in the background. So as Artemis 2 prepares to carry humans beyond low Earth orbit once again, it does so with layers of meaning that extend beyond the immediate mission profile. It is testing systems, yes, but it is also testing assumptions about autonomy, trust, risk, and the role of humans in an increasingly complex framework of exploration. And as we continue, we'll begin to look outward again, not just at the spacecraft or the crew, but at the destination itself, the Moon, and how its role in this new era of exploration may be more complex than it first appears. When we begin to shift our attention toward the destination of Artemis 2, something subtle starts to take shape, because the Moon, in many ways, feels like familiar territory. It has been visited, mapped, studied, and even walked upon. And yet, when you look at how it is being approached now, it begins to feel less like a completed chapter, and more like a location that was only briefly explored, then left behind before its full context was understood. From a mainstream scientific perspective, the Moon is well characterized. Its surface composition, its lack of atmosphere, its gravitational influence on Earth, all of these have been studied in detail. Samples returned during the Apollo program provided insights into its formation, supporting the widely accepted giant impact hypothesis. Robotic missions from multiple countries have continued to map its surface with increasing precision, identifying craters, lava plains, and regions of interest, such as the polar areas, where water ice is believed to exist. So if the Moon is already understood to this degree, why return in such a structured, multi-phase way? Why not simply resume where Apollo left off? The straightforward answer is that technology, goals, and expectations have changed. Apollo was about proving that humans could reach the Moon and return safely. Artemis, by contrast, is framed as the beginning of sustained exploration, potentially even long-term presence. But this shift in framing introduces a different set of priorities. It is no longer just about reaching the Moon. It is about how we interact with it over time. And that is where Artemis 2 plays a quiet but important role. Even though it does not land, It helps validate the systems and trajectories that will support future missions. It is part of establishing a reliable pathway, a kind of corridor between Earth and lunar orbit. Now, when you look at the Moon through this lens, certain regions begin to stand out more than others. The lunar South Pole, for example, has become a focal point for future missions. This is not arbitrary. Scientific data suggests that permanently shadowed craters in this region may contain water ice, an extremely valuable resource for future exploration. Water can be used for life support, but it can also be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen, potentially serving as fuel. From a practical standpoint, this makes the South Pole a logical target. But it also represents a shift in how the Moon is being viewed, not just as a place to visit, but as a place with resources that could support further exploration. And this is where the conversation begins to expand beyond pure science into something more layered. Because once resources enter the picture, the nature of exploration changes. It becomes less about isolated missions and more about infrastructure, logistics, and long-term planning. Artemis 2, while not directly involved in these aspects, is part of the early sequence that makes them possible. It helps establish confidence in the systems that will eventually support these more complex operations. And this leads to an interesting observation. The Moon is no longer just a destination. It is becoming a stepping stone. A place where technologies can be tested, where systems can be refined, and where the challenges of living and working beyond Earth can be addressed in a relatively nearby environment. Compared to Mars, the Moon is close. Communication delays are shorter. Travel times are manageable. It is, in many ways, an ideal testing ground. But if we step back again, a quieter question emerges. If the Moon is being positioned as a stepping stone, how much of the current architecture is designed specifically for that purpose, and how much is adaptable for something beyond it? In other words, is Artemis building a system optimized for lunar exploration, or a more general framework that could extend further into the solar system? The answer is not entirely clear, and perhaps it is not meant to be at this stage. Programs like Artemis often evolve as they progress, incorporating new technologies and adjusting to new priorities. But the way the Moon is being approached, through modular systems, international collaboration, and an emphasis on sustainability, suggests that the lessons learned there are intended to scale. Another detail worth considering is how the Moon's environment itself influences mission design. Unlike Earth, the Moon has no atmosphere to protect against radiation or micrometeorites. Its surface experiences extreme temperature variations, from intense heat in sunlight to deep cold in shadow. Dust on the lunar surface is fine, abrasive, and electrostatically charged, posing challenges for both equipment and human activity. These are not new discoveries, but they are being reconsidered in the context of longer missions. Apollo astronauts encountered lunar dust and reported its effects on equipment and even on their own health. Artemis missions will need to address these issues more thoroughly, especially if the goal is to establish a sustained presence. And here, Artemis 2 plays another subtle role. By sending humans into deep space again, it provides an opportunity to observe how modern systems perform in an environment that is closer to the lunar context than low Earth orbit. It helps bridge the gap between controlled conditions and the more demanding reality of operating near the Moon. There is also a broader perspective to consider, one that extends beyond engineering and science. The Moon occupies a unique place in human culture. It has been a constant presence in the sky, a source of inspiration, mythology, and observation for thousands of years. Returning to it is not just a technical achievement, it is a symbolic act, one that reconnects modern exploration with a much older human curiosity. This symbolism is often acknowledged, but it is also carefully managed. Artemis 2 is presented as a step in a larger program, not as a singular defining moment. This reflects a shift away from the dramatic milestones of the past toward a more continuous, process-oriented approach. But even within that framework, the act of sending humans around the moon again carries a certain weight, a sense of revisiting something that has been absent for a long time. And that absence itself is worth reflecting on. For decades, the moon has been visible, constant, and yet untouched by human presence. Robotic missions have continued to explore it, but the human connection has been missing. Artemis 2 begins to restore that connection, not by landing, but by re-establishing a human presence in its vicinity. So as the mission unfolds, it does more than test systems and validate trajectories. It reopens a pathway, one that leads not just to the moon, but potentially beyond it. And in doing so, it invites a new set of questions, not about whether we can reach the moon, we already know that, but about what we intend to do once we are there again, and how those intentions might shape the future of exploration. As we continue, we'll begin to look at the timeline itself, the delays, the adjustments, and the moments where plans change direction. Because in those shifts, there are often patterns that reveal as much as the missions themselves. When you begin to examine the timeline of Artemis 2, it doesn't unfold as a straight, uninterrupted progression. It moves more like a slow tide, advancing, pausing, and occasionally pulling back before moving forward again. And this rhythm, while often explained through technical or logistical challenges, reveals something deeper when observed carefully. Because timelines in space exploration are rarely just about engineering. They are shaped by layers of influence that extend far beyond the launch pad. From a mainstream perspective, the delays associated with Artemis 2 are not unusual. Large-scale space programs are inherently complex. Developing new systems, testing them thoroughly, and ensuring crew safety requires time. The Space Launch System has undergone years of development, with multiple test phases and adjustments. The Orion spacecraft has similarly evolved, incorporating lessons learned from earlier programs and uncrewed test flights like Artemis 1. Each delay is typically explained in practical terms. Technical issues are identified and resolved. Safety margins are reassessed. Integration between systems is refined. These are all expected steps in a program of this scale. And yet, when you step back and look at the broader pattern, not just Artemis, but the decades leading up to it, you begin to notice that returning to the moon has consistently taken longer than anticipated. This is not necessarily a sign of failure. It may simply reflect the reality that space exploration is more challenging than initial projections often suggest. But it also raises an interesting question. Are these delays purely reactive, or are they part of a more cautious, deliberate pacing that reflects changing priorities? Because if we compare Artemis to the Apollo program, the difference in tempo is striking. Apollo moved from its first crewed mission to a lunar landing in a relatively short span of time. This was driven by a clear, urgent objective tied to the geopolitical context of the Cold War. The timeline was compressed, risks were accepted, and resources were concentrated. Artemis operates under very different conditions. There is no singular deadline imposed by external competition, at least not in the same overt way. Instead, the program is shaped by a combination of scientific goals, international partnerships, commercial involvement, and long-term planning. This creates a more distributed decision-making process, where adjustments are not just responses to technical challenges, but also to shifting alignments between stakeholders. And this is where the timeline begins to feel less like a sequence of delays and more like a process of calibration. Each adjustment reflects new information, new constraints, or new opportunities. The schedule becomes a living structure, adapting as the program evolves. But there is another layer to consider: perception. Public timelines often serve as both planning tools and communication strategies. Announced launch dates create expectations, generate interest, and provide a sense of progress. When those dates shift, it can appear as though the program is struggling, even if the underlying work is proceeding as intended. So Artemis 2 exists in a space between two realities. On one level, it is a carefully managed development process, progressing through necessary stages. On another, it is a publicly visible milestone, subject to interpretation based on how its timeline changes over time. And when you observe this carefully, a subtle pattern emerges. The closer a mission gets to involving human crew, the more cautious the timeline becomes. Uncrewed tests can proceed with a certain level of risk because they do not carry the same immediate human consequences. But once astronauts are involved, the margin for error narrows significantly. This is not just a technical consideration, it is also psychological and institutional. The legacy of past missions, including both successes and failures, influences how decisions are made. Every component, every system, every procedure is examined with a level of scrutiny that reflects not just current knowledge, but historical experience. And this leads to an interesting question. How much of the timeline is driven by what is possible, and how much by what is acceptable? Because those are not always the same. A system might be technically ready, but still undergo additional testing to meet higher safety standards. A launch window might be available, but postponed to ensure greater confidence in performance. From a purely rational standpoint, this makes sense. The cost of failure in a crewed mission is too high to justify unnecessary risk, but it also contributes to the extended timelines we observe. Artemis 2 is not just moving forward, it is moving forward carefully, deliberately, and with a constant reassessment of what ready truly means. There is also the influence of external factors: funding cycles, political support, and international agreements. Space programs operate within broader systems that can shift over time. Budgets are allocated annually, priorities can change with new administrations, and partnerships require ongoing coordination. These factors do not always appear in technical discussions, but they shape the timeline in very real ways. For example, the integration of international components, such as the service module provided by European Space Agency, introduces additional coordination requirements. Schedules must align across organizations, testing must be synchronized, and any adjustments in one area can affect others. This interconnected structure adds resilience in some ways, but also complexity. And complexity, as we've seen, tends to slow things down, not because progress stops, but because more variables must be managed simultaneously. If you look at Artemis 2 through this lens, the timeline becomes more than just a schedule. It becomes a reflection of how modern space exploration operates, slower in some respects, but also more comprehensive. Less driven by singular urgency, but more focused on sustainability and long-term capability. And yet, even within this careful pacing, there is a sense of momentum. Each completed test, each resolved issue, each refined system brings the mission closer to launch. The movement may be gradual, but it is continuous. So perhaps the more interesting question is not why Artemis 2 has taken time to develop, but what that time represents. Is it a delay in the traditional sense? Or is it an investment in a different kind of exploration, one that prioritizes endurance over speed? As we continue, we'll begin to look at another layer that often sits quietly beneath the surface: the role of competition and cooperation in shaping missions like Artemis 2, and how those forces may be influencing decisions in ways that are not always immediately visible. As we move a little deeper into the structure surrounding Artemis 2, the focus begins to shift towards something that is rarely stated outright, yet quietly shapes almost every major decision: the balance between competition and cooperation. And unlike the more visible technical elements we've explored so far, this layer operates in a more subtle way, influencing direction without always appearing in the official narrative. From a mainstream perspective, the current era of space exploration is often described as collaborative. Agencies like NASA work alongside partners such as the European Space Agency, as well as other international contributors. The Artemis program itself includes agreements with multiple countries, sharing responsibilities, technologies, and future access to lunar missions. This is presented as a natural evolution from the competitive environment of the Cold War, where space exploration was closely tied to national rivalry. And on the surface, this shift toward cooperation is very real. Joint missions, shared research, and coordinated development efforts are now common. Artemis 2 reflects this through its integrated systems, international components, and broader participation. It is not a mission built by a single entity, but by a network of contributors working toward a shared goal. But if you pause and examine the broader context, another layer begins to appear. One where cooperation and competition are not opposites, but intertwined. Because while agencies collaborate, they also operate within a global environment where technological capability, strategic positioning, and long-term presence in space carry significant weight. The Moon, in this context, is not just a scientific destination. It is increasingly viewed as a point of strategic interest. Its resources, its location, and its potential role as a staging ground for further exploration all contribute to its importance. And while this is often discussed in practical terms, such as resource utilization or mission logistics, it also introduces a competitive dimension, even if it is not framed that way publicly. So Artemis 2 can be seen as part of a broader signal, not just that humans are returning to the Moon, but that a particular framework for doing so is being established. A framework that includes specific technologies, specific partnerships, and specific operational models. And once such a framework is in place, it tends to shape future missions in ways that are not easily altered. This is not necessarily intentional in a strategic sense. It may simply be a natural outcome of building complex systems. But the effect is similar. Early decisions create pathways that become increasingly influential over time. And this is where the balance between cooperation and competition becomes more nuanced. International partnerships within Artemis are structured through agreements that outline principles for exploration, resource use, and collaboration. These agreements encourage transparency and shared access, but they also define a particular approach to how space activities are conducted. At the same time, other nations and organizations are developing their own lunar programs, with their own timelines, technologies, and objectives. These efforts may not directly conflict, but they exist alongside Artemis, creating a landscape where multiple approaches to lunar exploration are emerging simultaneously. From a purely observational standpoint, this creates a kind of parallel development. Different systems, different strategies, all moving towards similar destinations. And Artemis 2, while focused on its specific mission, is part of that larger pattern. Now, none of this suggests overt rivalry in the traditional sense. The tone of modern space exploration is far less confrontational than during the Cold War. But competition does not always need to be explicit to exist. It can take the form of technological advancement, of establishing presence, or of setting standards that others may follow. And this brings us back to Artemis 2. As a crewed mission, it carries a level of visibility and significance that uncrewed missions do not. It demonstrates not just capability, but confidence. The ability to send humans beyond low Earth orbit again is, in itself, a statement about technological readiness and operational maturity. At the same time, the cooperative aspects of the mission, such as the involvement of the European Service Module, highlight a different message. That exploration is not being pursued in isolation, but as part of a network of shared efforts. These two messages exist side by side, creating a balance that is carefully maintained. If you look closely, this balance influences how the mission is presented. The language used in official communications often emphasizes partnership, sustainability, and shared goals. These are important themes, and they reflect genuine aspects of the program. But they also shape perception, framing Artemis 2 as part of a collective endeavor rather than a singular achievement. And perception, as we've seen, plays a significant role in how space missions are understood. It influences public support, funding decisions, and the broader narrative of exploration. Artemis 2, in this sense, is not just a technical mission. It is also a story being told, one that connects past exploration with future ambitions in a way that resonates with a global audience. There is also a quieter question embedded in all of this. How stable is this balance between cooperation and competition? As lunar exploration progresses, and as more capabilities are developed, will the emphasis remain on collaboration, or will priorities shift? It is difficult to say, because these dynamics are influenced by factors that extend beyond space exploration itself. But what we can observe is that Artemis 2 exists at a point where these forces are still aligned. Cooperation provides the framework, competition provides the momentum, and the mission itself becomes a point where both are expressed in a controlled, measured way. And perhaps that is one of the more subtle aspects of Artemis 2. It is not just about testing systems or sending astronauts around the moon. It is about demonstrating that a particular model of exploration, one that blends shared effort with individual capability, can function effectively in practice. As we continue, we'll begin to look even further ahead at how the outcomes of Artemis 2 might influence the missions that follow, and how small details in this early stage could shape decisions that extend far beyond the moon itself. As we begin to look beyond the immediate scope of Artemis 2, the mission starts to feel less like an isolated event, and more like a kind of quiet turning point. One where the outcomes, even the small ones, begin to ripple outward into future decisions. And what makes this particularly interesting is that many of those outcomes will not be dramatic or immediately visible. They will be subtle adjustments, data points, refinements, confirmations that gradually shape what comes next. From a mainstream perspective, Artemis 2 is a stepping stone toward Artemis 3, which aims to return humans to the lunar surface. That is the clearly stated progression. The systems tested during Artemis 2, life support, navigation, communication, and crew operations, feed directly into the readiness for that next mission. If everything performs as expected, confidence increases. If issues arise, they are addressed before moving forward. This is a standard approach in complex engineering programs, but what is often less visible is how much flexibility exists within that progression. Artemis 3, for example, depends on additional systems that are not part of Artemis 2, including human landing vehicles and supporting infrastructure. These elements are being developed in parallel, and their timelines are not perfectly synchronized. So the results of Artemis 2 do not just influence whether Artemis 3 proceeds, they influence how it proceeds. Adjustments in one area can lead to changes in another, A system that performs differently than expected might require redesigns, new procedures, or even shifts in mission architecture. And this is where the mission begins to take on a different kind of importance. It is not just validating what already exists. It is informing decisions that have not yet been finalized. It is, in a sense, shaping the path forward in real time. If we look at this from a slightly wider angle, a pattern emerges that extends beyond Artemis itself. Modern space exploration is increasingly iterative. Instead of defining a complete system from the beginning and executing it exactly as planned, programs evolve as they progress. New technologies are incorporated, new partnerships are formed, and new objectives are introduced. This approach has advantages. It allows for adaptation, for the integration of innovation, and for the correction of earlier assumptions. But it also means that early missions like Artemis 2 carry a kind of disproportionate influence. Because they occur at a stage where many decisions are still flexible, the data they provide can shift the direction of the entire program. For example, consider how the crew interacts with the Orion spacecraft during the mission. Their experience, how intuitive the systems are, how effectively automation supports their tasks, how communication delays are managed, will feed into future design choices. These are not abstract considerations. They can lead to tangible changes in interfaces, procedures, and even hardware configurations. Similarly, the performance of the space launch system during a crewed mission carries a different weight than during uncrewed tests. It is one thing to demonstrate capability in principle. It is another to do so with human lives on board. The data collected during Artemis 2 will influence not just technical assessments, but also confidence, both within the program and among its stakeholders. And confidence, while not always discussed in technical terms, is a critical factor. It affects funding decisions, international cooperation, and the willingness to commit to more ambitious missions. A successful Artemis 2 reinforces the idea that the current approach is working. Any unexpected challenges, on the other hand, may prompt re-evaluation. There is also the question of scalability. As we've explored earlier, Artemis is built around a modular architecture, with different systems handling different roles. Artemis 2 tests part of that system, but not all of it. The integration of additional elements, such as lunar landers or orbital platforms, will introduce new layers of complexity. So one of the quieter roles of Artemis 2 is to provide a baseline, a reference point against which future systems can be measured. If Orion and SLS perform reliably, they become stable components around which other elements can be built. If adjustments are needed, those changes ripple outward, affecting how the rest of the system is designed. And then there is the human factor again, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of perception. The way the mission is experienced by the crew and how that experience is communicated back to Earth will shape how future missions are framed. It influences how risk is understood, how challenges are described, and how the broader narrative of exploration evolves. This may seem like a softer aspect compared to engineering data, but it is deeply connected. Public perception can influence political support, which in turn affects funding and long-term commitment. Artemis 2, as a highly visible mission, contributes to that perception in a way that earlier, less prominent tests do not. If we step back even further, another question begins to take shape. How much of the future is already embedded in the present design? In other words, to what extent are the systems we see now, Orion, SLS, the broader Artemis framework, intended to remain central to exploration in the coming decades? There are differing perspectives on this. Some view Artemis as a long-term foundation, a system that will evolve but remain fundamentally consistent. Others see it as a transitional phase, a bridge toward newer technologies and approaches that are still emerging. Artemis 2 does not resolve this question, but it provides data that will inform it. If the current systems prove effective and adaptable, they are more likely to remain central. If limitations become apparent, there may be greater incentive to accelerate the development of alternative approaches. And so the mission exists in this interesting position, grounded in the present, but quietly influencing the future. It is both a test of what has been built and a guide for what has yet to be decided. As we continue, we'll begin to explore some of the less obvious constraints that shape missions like Artemis 2. The underlying factors that are not always visible in technical descriptions, but that influence design, timelines, and priorities in ways that are worth examining more closely. As we continue to follow the deeper structure behind Artemis 2, we begin to arrive at something that is rarely discussed directly, yet quietly present in almost every layer we've explored so far. Constraints. Not just the obvious technical ones, but the underlying limits that shape decisions long before a spacecraft ever leaves the ground. And what makes these constraints particularly interesting is that they don't always appear as restrictions. They often appear as design choices, timelines, or even as the way things are done. From a mainstream perspective, constraints in space missions are usually framed in terms of physics and engineering. The limits of propulsion, the challenges of shielding against radiation, the need to manage mass and energy. These are all real and unavoidable. The Orion spacecraft must operate within strict parameters to sustain human life. The Space Launch System must generate enough liquid to escape Earth's gravity while maintaining structural integrity. Every component is designed within boundaries that are well understood. But when you begin to look more closely, another layer of constraints becomes visible, ones that are not dictated by physics alone. These include budgetary limits, institutional structures, historical decisions, and even the expectations of stakeholders. And while these factors are often acknowledged, they are not always examined in the same way as technical constraints, even though their influence can be just as significant. For example, consider how funding cycles shape the development of a mission. Space programs like Artemis are not funded in a single continuous flow. They are supported through annual budgets, subject to approval, adjustment, and sometimes uncertainty. This means that development must be structured in phases, with clear milestones that justify continued investment. Artemis 2, as a crewed mission, represents one of those milestones, a point where progress becomes visible and measurable. From a practical standpoint, this structure ensures accountability, but it also introduces a certain rhythm to the program, where decisions are influenced not just by what is technically optimal, but by what aligns with funding timelines. This can affect everything from the pace of development to the prioritization of specific systems. Then, there is the influence of legacy decisions. As we've touched on before, the Artemis program incorporates technologies and concepts that originated in earlier initiatives, such as the Constellation program. The continued use of certain components, like those in the Space Launch System, reflects a combination of practicality and continuity. Existing expertise, infrastructure, and manufacturing capabilities are leveraged to move the program forward. But legacy decisions can also act as constraints. Once a particular path is chosen, it becomes increasingly difficult to deviate from it without significant cost or delay. This creates a kind of momentum where the program continues along a trajectory that was set years earlier, even as new technologies or approaches become available. And this leads to an interesting question. How much flexibility truly exists within a program like Artemis? On the surface, it appears adaptable, incorporating new elements and partnerships as it evolves. But beneath that adaptability There are structural elements that are more fixed, shaping the range of possible changes. Another constraint that is less visible, but equally important, is the need for consensus. Artemis is not a single entity program. It involves multiple organizations, including NASA, international partners like the European Space Agency, and various commercial companies. Each of these participants has its own objectives, priorities, and constraints. Coordinating these perspectives requires negotiation and alignment, which can influence decision-making in subtle ways. Choices about design, timelines, and mission architecture are not made in isolation. They are shaped by what is acceptable and feasible for all involved parties. This can lead to solutions that are not necessarily the most direct or efficient, but are the most workable within the given framework. And then there is the constraint of perception, how the mission is viewed by the public, by policymakers, and by the broader global community. Artemis II, as a highly visible mission, must meet not only technical expectations but also narrative ones. It must demonstrate progress, justify investment, and inspire confidence. This does not mean that decisions are made purely for appearance, but it does mean that perception plays a role. Milestones are chosen not just for their technical significance, but for their ability to communicate progress. Artemis II, as the first crewed mission of the program, carries that communicative weight. If we bring these layers together, technical, financial, historical, institutional, and perceptual, a more complex picture begins to form. Artemis II is not simply the result of solving engineering problems. It is the outcome of navigating a network of constraints, each influencing the others in ways that are not always immediately visible. And within this network, patterns begin to emerge. The modular architecture we discussed earlier, for example, can be seen as a response to multiple constraints at once. It allows for phased development, aligns with funding structures, accommodates international contributions, and provides flexibility for future expansion. Similarly, the pacing of the program reflects a balance between technical readiness, risk management, and external expectations. It is not just about moving forward, it is about moving forward in a way that maintains stability across all these layers. Now, none of this implies that Artemis II is constrained in a negative sense. Constraints are a natural part of any complex system. They define the boundaries within which solutions are found. But understanding those boundaries can reveal why certain choices are made and why others are not. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of all is that these constraints are not static. They evolve over time. Budgets change, technologies advance, partnerships shift, and public interest fluctuates. This means that the framework within which Artemis operates is constantly being adjusted, even as the mission itself moves forward. So Artemis II becomes, in a way, a snapshot, a moment where all these constraints align in a particular configuration, allowing the mission to proceed. But that configuration is not permanent. It will continue to evolve, influencing the missions that follow in ways that may not yet be fully visible. As we continue, we'll begin to explore one of the more intriguing aspects of all, the subtle inconsistencies and open questions that remain within the Artemis framework. Not as conclusions, but as points of curiosity, places where the available information leaves room for deeper examination. As we move further into the structure behind Artemis II, we begin to arrive at a quieter, more nuanced layer, not defined by what is clearly explained, but by what remains slightly open, slightly unresolved. These are not contradictions in the dramatic sense, but small inconsistencies, gaps, or areas where the available information invites a second look. And it is often in these spaces, not in what is confirmed, but in what is still forming, that the most interesting questions begin to take shape. From a mainstream perspective, Artemis 2 is well documented. Its mission profile, its systems, its role within the broader Artemis program, all of these are described in detail. And yet, when you follow the connections between those details, certain edges begin to blur. Not because information is missing entirely, but because different parts of the program are evolving at different speeds. For example, Artemis 2 is positioned as a step toward Artemis 3, which is expected to include a lunar landing. That progression is clear, but when you examine the components required for Artemis 3, particularly the human landing systems, you notice that they are still in active development, with timelines that are not perfectly aligned with the earlier missions. This is not unusual in complex programs. Parallel development allows progress to continue, even as certain elements are still being refined. But it does create a kind of temporal gap, a space where one part of the system is ready to move forward while another is still catching up. And within that gap, decisions must be made about pacing, priorities, and how to manage the transition between phases. So one question that naturally emerges is this: how fixed is the sequence of Artemis missions? Is Artemis 2 simply a stepping stone that leads directly into Artemis 3, or is there flexibility in how the program unfolds depending on how different elements progress? The answer, based on what we can observe, appears to lean toward flexibility. Plans are outlined, but they are not entirely rigid. Adjustments are made as new data becomes available, as technologies mature, and as external factors shift. Artemis 2, in this sense, is both a defined mission and a point of decision, a moment where the next steps can be reassessed based on real-world performance. Another subtle area worth examining is the balance between innovation and reliability. As we've discussed, systems like the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft incorporate both legacy technology and modern design. This hybrid approach is often presented as a strength, combining proven components with new capabilities. But it also introduces an interesting tension. Legacy systems are well understood, but they may not be optimized for current or future needs. New technologies offer potential improvements, but they come with greater uncertainty. Artemis 2 operates within this balance, relying on systems that are intended to be both dependable and forward-looking. And this raises a quieter question. How long will this balance be maintained? At what point does the program begin to shift more fully toward newer approaches? And what factors determine that transition? Artemis 2 does not answer this directly, but it provides data that will influence how that decision is approached. There is also the question of scale. Artemis is often described as the beginning of a sustained presence on and around the Moon. This implies a level of infrastructure, orbital platforms, surface habitats, logistical support that extends far beyond the scope of Artemis 2. Yet much of that infrastructure is still conceptual or in early development stages. So Artemis 2 exists in an interesting position. It is part of a long-term vision, but it operates within a present that is still being constructed. This creates a kind of dual perspective, where the mission must succeed on its own terms, while also fitting into a larger framework that is not yet fully realized. And within that dual perspective, small inconsistencies can appear, not as errors, but as natural results of a system that is still evolving. Timelines shift, priorities adjust, certain elements move forward more quickly than others. These are all expected, but they also create areas where the overall picture is not perfectly synchronized. Another point of curiosity lies in how success is defined. For Artemis 2, the primary objectives are clear: safely send a crew around the Moon and return them to Earth while testing critical systems. But beyond those objectives, there are secondary outcomes: data collection, operational experience, public perception, that are less precisely defined but equally important. These secondary outcomes can influence future decisions in ways that are not always immediately visible. A system that meets its technical requirements but proves difficult to operate may be redesigned. A mission that succeeds technically but fails to capture public interest may be framed differently in the future. Artemis 2 contributes to all of these layers, even if they are not explicitly stated in its mission objectives. And then there is the broader question of direction. Artemis is often described as a pathway to Mars, with the moon serving as a testing ground. This is a widely accepted narrative, supported by the idea that technologies developed for lunar missions can be adapted for deeper space exploration. But if you look closely, the connection between lunar and Martian missions is not entirely straightforward. The environments are different, the distances are vastly greater, and the challenges are not identical. So while the moon provides valuable experience, it is not a perfect analog for Mars. This does not diminish its importance, but it does introduce a subtle gap in the narrative. How directly does progress on the moon translate to progress toward Mars? And how much of the current architecture is designed with that transition in mind? Artemis 2, again, does not resolve this question, but it contributes to the process of answering it by providing real-world data on how systems and crews perform beyond low Earth orbit. If we bring all of these threads together, a pattern begins to emerge. One where Artemis 2 is both clearly defined and quietly open-ended. It has specific goals, but it also exists within a framework that is still taking shape. It answers certain questions, but it also raises new ones, and perhaps that is one of the most interesting aspects of all. The mission is not just about confirming what we already know, it is about revealing what we do not yet fully understand. Not in a dramatic or mysterious sense, but in the steady, methodical way that complex systems evolve over time. As we continue, we'll begin to explore how these open questions and subtle inconsistencies might influence the long-term trajectory of human space exploration, and what Artemis 2 may quietly be setting in motion, far beyond its immediate objectives. As we continue following the deeper trajectory behind Artemis 2, the perspective begins to stretch further into the future, beyond the immediate goals, beyond even the next few missions, into something more gradual and less clearly defined. Because what Artemis 2 is really doing, in a quiet and methodical way, is helping to establish a direction. Not a fixed destination, but a path. And paths, once set in motion, tend to influence decisions long after their starting point has passed. From a mainstream point of view, the long-term vision tied to Artemis is relatively clear. The moon becomes a place of sustained presence, orbital platforms, surface missions, resource utilization, and from there, the experience gained is intended to support eventual missions to Mars. This progression is often presented as a logical sequence: Earth orbit to moon, moon to Mars, and beyond. But if you slow down and examine that sequence more carefully, it begins to feel less like a straight line and more like a branching structure. Because each step introduces new capabilities, but also new commitments. Once infrastructure begins to form around the moon, whether in orbit or on the surface, it creates a gravitational pull of its own, not in the physical sense, but in terms of focus and resources. And this leads to an interesting question. Does establishing a sustained presence on the moon accelerate the journey to Mars, or does it reshape it into something different? Because maintaining infrastructure requires ongoing support. Missions are no longer isolated, they become part of a continuous system, and continuous systems tend to reinforce themselves over time. Artemis 2 sits right at the beginning of that transition. It is not building infrastructure directly, but it is validating the pathway that will make that infrastructure possible. It is confirming that humans can once again operate beyond low Earth orbit, using systems that are designed to be part of a larger, ongoing framework. And within that framework, certain patterns begin to take shape. The reliance on the Orion spacecraft as a transport vehicle, the use of the Space Launch System as a primary launch system, the integration of international and commercial partners. These elements form a kind of baseline. They define how missions are conducted, at least in the early stages. But baselines are not permanent. They evolve as new technologies emerge and as priorities shift. And this is where Artemis 2 becomes particularly interesting. Not because it defines the final form of exploration, but because it helps determine which aspects of the current approach are reinforced and which may eventually be replaced. For instance, if the combination of SLS and Orion proves consistently reliable, it may remain central to future missions for longer than initially expected. But if limitations become apparent, whether in cost, scalability, or flexibility, there may be increased pressure to transition toward alternative systems. Artemis 2 provides data that feeds directly into these considerations, even if the implications are not immediately visible. There is also the role of timing. The development of new technologies does not occur in isolation. It overlaps with existing programs, creating moments where decisions must be made about whether to continue with established systems or shift toward newer ones. These moments are not always clearly defined. They emerge gradually as capabilities change. And this introduces a subtle kind of uncertainty. Not uncertainty about whether exploration will continue, but about how it will evolve. Artemis 2 contributes to reducing some uncertainties about system performance, human factors, operational procedures, but it also highlights others, particularly those related to long-term direction. Another layer to consider is how the experience of Artemis 2 shapes expectations. Once humans return to deep space, even briefly, it changes the baseline for what is considered possible. It re-establishes a capability that has been absent for decades. And once that capability is demonstrated, the question shifts from, can we do this, to what do we do next? This shift in expectation can influence decision-making in ways that are not always immediately obvious. It can create momentum, encouraging further missions and greater investment. But it can also raise the bar, increasing the pressure to move beyond initial achievements toward more ambitious goals. And within that dynamic, the moon itself begins to take on a different role, not just as a destination, but as a context, a place where multiple objectives intersect. Scientific research, technological development, resource utilization, and even geopolitical considerations all converge in this relatively small, nearby environment. Artemis 2 does not directly engage with all of these aspects, but it exists within the system that supports them. It is part of the process that makes those broader objectives feasible. And as such, it carries implications that extend beyond its immediate mission profile. If we step back once more, a pattern becomes visible, one where early missions set conditions that shape later ones, not through dramatic decisions, but through accumulated effects. A system that works well becomes standard. A partnership that proves effective is expanded. A design choice that simplifies operations is retained. Over time, these accumulated effects create a kind of trajectory. And once that trajectory is established, changing it becomes more complex. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires adjusting multiple interconnected elements. So Artemis 2 can be seen as part of that early shaping process. It is contributing to the formation of a trajectory that will influence not just the next mission, but potentially the next phase of human space exploration. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of all is that this shaping is happening in real time. It is not fully predetermined. It is responsive, adaptive, and influenced by the outcomes of each step along the way. As we continue, we'll begin to explore one final layer: the broader perspective of how missions like Artemis 2 fit into humanity's long-term relationship with space, and what patterns, both past and present, might suggest about where this path ultimately leads. As we move into a wider perspective around Artemis 2, something begins to shift, not in the mission itself, but in how we place it within a much longer timeline. Because when you step far enough back, Artemis 2 is not just part of a program or even a generation of exploration. It becomes part of a repeating pattern in human behavior. A pattern that stretches from the earliest seafaring voyages to modern orbital missions. The gradual expansion outward, followed by periods of consolidation and then expansion again. From a mainstream historical perspective, exploration tends to move in cycles. There are moments of rapid advancement, driven by necessity, competition, or curiosity, followed by periods where those gains are stabilized, studied, and integrated into broader systems. The Apollo program fits clearly into that first category. It was a rapid, focused push outward, achieving something unprecedented in a relatively short time. What followed was not a continuation of that outward movement, but a shift inward, toward low Earth orbit, toward sustainability, toward learning how to live and work in space over longer durations. Programs like the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station represent this phase. They did not extend humanity's reach dramatically farther, but they deepened our understanding of how to operate beyond Earth. Now, with Artemis, and specifically Artemis 2, we appear to be entering another expansion phase. But it is not identical to Apollo. It is slower, more distributed, and more interconnected. And this difference may reflect something deeper about how exploration evolves over time. Because early exploration often prioritizes reaching a destination. Later exploration focuses on maintaining a presence. And the transition between those two phases is rarely simple. It requires new systems, new strategies, and often a rethinking of what exploration is meant to achieve. Artemis 2 sits precisely at that transition point. It is not the first step outward. That was Artemis 1. And it is not the establishment of presence that is still to come. Instead, it is the moment where human involvement returns to deep space within a framework that is designed for continuity rather than singular achievement. And that distinction matters, because a mission designed for continuity must operate differently from one designed for a one-time goal. It must consider not just success, but repeatability, not just capability, but sustainability. This is where the broader pattern becomes more visible. The systems being tested, like the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System, are not just tools for reaching the moon. They are components of a system that is intended to function over time. And the success of Artemis 2 is measured not just by whether it completes its mission, but by how well it contributes to that ongoing system. Now, if we extend this pattern even further, another question begins to emerge. What happens after the phase of sustained presence? Historically, once a new environment becomes accessible and manageable, it often becomes a starting point for further expansion. Coastal settlements lead to inland exploration. Orbital stations lead to deeper missions. So if the moon becomes a stable point of human activity, does it naturally lead to a renewed push toward Mars and beyond? Or does it become a focus in its own right, absorbing attention and resources for a longer period than currently anticipated? There are arguments for both possibilities. The moon offers immediate opportunities for scientific research and resource utilization. It is close enough to allow relatively frequent missions, and its environment provides a testing ground for technologies that could be used elsewhere. At the same time, the challenges of Mars, distance, duration, and environmental complexity remain significant. Transitioning from lunar operations to Martian missions is not a simple step. It requires new solutions, new systems, and a different scale of commitment. So Artemis 2 exists within this larger uncertainty. It is part of a process that could lead in multiple directions, depending on how the next phases unfold. Another layer to consider is how human perception of space changes over time. During Apollo, the moon was seen as distant, almost unreachable, until it suddenly wasn't. Then, for decades, it became something familiar, yet inaccessible again. A presence in the sky, but not in human experience. Artemis 2 begins to shift that perception once more. By sending humans around the moon, it reintroduces the idea that deep space is within reach, not as a distant memory, but as a current capability. And perception, as we've seen before, has a way of influencing reality. What feels possible tends to shape what is pursued. What becomes familiar tends to be expanded upon. So in a quiet way, Artemis 2 is not just testing systems or validating trajectories. It is reshaping perception. It is moving the boundary of what feels accessible, even if only slightly. If we bring all of this together, a larger pattern begins to take form. Artemis 2 is part of a cycle, one that includes expansion, consolidation, and expansion again. It is a bridge between phases, connecting past achievements with future possibilities. But unlike previous cycles, this one is unfolding in a more complex environment. There are more participants, more technologies, and more interconnected systems. This complexity adds both capability and uncertainty, making the path forward less predictable. And perhaps that is where the most interesting questions lie. Not in what Artemis 2 will do, that is relatively well understood, but in how it will influence what comes next, and how those influences will accumulate over time. As we continue, we'll begin to draw these threads together, looking at the patterns, the decisions, and the subtle signals that may hint at where this path is ultimately leading, without assuming that the destination is already fixed. As we begin to draw the threads of Artemis 2 a little closer together, something interesting starts to emerge, not as a single conclusion, but as a pattern of signals. Small, consistent indicators that, when viewed individually, seem routine, but when placed side by side, begin to suggest a direction. And this is where the perspective shifts again, away from isolated details and toward the underlying structure that connects them. From a mainstream standpoint, everything we've explored so far fits within a logical framework. Artemis 2 is a crewed test mission. It validates systems, prepares for future landings, and contributes to a long-term plan for lunar exploration. Each element, the Orion spacecraft, the Space Launch System, the partnerships, the timeline, has a clear purpose within that framework. But when you begin to look at how these elements interact, a deeper structure becomes visible. One that is less about individual missions and more about the establishment of a system. Not just a technical system, but an operational one, a way of doing exploration that can persist over time. And the signals pointing toward this are subtle, but consistent. The modular design we discussed earlier allows different components to evolve independently while still functioning as part of a whole. The involvement of international partners distributes both responsibility and capability. The incremental pacing of missions reduces risk while building continuity. Individually, these choices are practical. Together, they form a pattern that emphasizes sustainability over speed, integration over independence, and continuity over singular achievement. And this pattern raises an interesting question. Is Artemis 2 part of a transition from exploration as an event to exploration as an ongoing process? Because if you compare it to earlier eras, the difference becomes more apparent. The Apollo program was defined by milestones: first orbit, first landing, first return. Each mission was a step toward a clearly defined endpoint. Artemis, by contrast, does not have a single endpoint in the same way. It is structured as a sequence of missions that lead into further missions, with no immediate conclusion. The goal is not just to reach the moon again, but to remain connected to it, to establish a presence that can be maintained and expanded. Artemis 2, in this context, becomes one of the first confirmations that this new model is viable. It tests whether the system can function with humans involved, whether the balance between automation and crew control works in practice, and whether the integration of multiple components can be managed effectively. But there is another layer to this pattern, one that is less technical and more strategic. The establishment of a sustained presence in space, whether around the moon or on its surface, creates a kind of anchor point, a location where operations can be based, expanded, and supported. And once such an anchor point exists, it changes how future missions are approached. Instead of launching every mission from Earth with all necessary resources, operations can be staged, distributed, and supported from multiple locations. This is a fundamental shift in how exploration is conducted. Now, this is still in its early stages. Artemis 2 does not establish that presence directly, but it contributes to the conditions that make it possible. It helps validate the pathway, the systems, and the operational model that future missions will rely on. And this leads to another subtle observation. The decisions being made now are not just about immediate needs. They are about shaping a framework that will influence exploration for years, perhaps decades. Choices about technology, partnerships, and mission architecture create precedents that are not easily changed later. This does not mean those choices are fixed forever, but it does mean they carry weight beyond the present moment. Artemis 2, as part of this early phase, plays a role in reinforcing certain approaches while leaving others less explored. If we look at this from a slightly different angle, another question begins to form. How much of this structure is intentional, and how much is emerging naturally from the constraints and opportunities we've discussed? Because systems like this often evolve through a combination of planning and adaptation. Some elements are designed with long-term goals in mind. Others arise as practical solutions to immediate challenges. Over time, these elements come together to form a coherent structure, even if that structure was not fully defined at the beginning. Artemis 2 sits within that process. It is both planned and adaptive, both defined and evolving. And that dual nature is part of what makes it so interesting to examine. There is also the role of continuity itself. Once a system begins to operate successfully, there is a natural tendency to continue along the same path. Not because alternatives are impossible, but because continuity reduces uncertainty. It builds on what is already known, already tested, already functioning. So a successful Artemis 2 does more than validate a mission. It reinforces a trajectory. It increases the likelihood that future missions will follow a similar structure, at least in the near term. And that brings us to a quieter, more reflective point. One that doesn't have a clear answer, but is worth considering. If Artemis 2 is part of establishing a long-term system for space exploration, what kind of system is it becoming? Is it one that prioritizes accessibility and expansion, gradually extending human presence outward? Is it one that focuses on specific strategic locations, building depth rather than breadth? Or is it something that will continue to evolve, shaped by factors that are not yet fully visible? These are not questions that Artemis 2 can answer on its own. but it contributes to the process of answering them by providing data, experience, and a clearer understanding of what works and what does not. And as we move forward, we'll begin to bring these ideas even closer together, looking at the overall picture that emerges from all these layers and exploring what it might suggest about the direction of human exploration, not as a fixed path, but as a pattern that is still unfolding. As we move closer to a complete picture of Artemis 2, the perspective becomes quieter, more reflective, less about individual components, and more about how everything we've explored begins to settle into a single, continuous pattern. Because by now, the mission is no longer just a technical event in isolation. It has become something that sits at the intersection of history, technology, human behavior, and long-term direction. From a mainstream point of view, the narrative remains consistent. Artemis 2 is a necessary step, a crude mission to validate systems before attempting a lunar landing again. It follows Artemis 1, it prepares for Artemis 3, and it contributes to a broader goal of sustained exploration. Everything fits within a logical sequence. But when you allow all the layers we've explored to exist together, the timelines, the constraints, the partnerships, the human factors, the evolving architecture, something more complex begins to take shape. Not a contradiction, but a kind of quiet tension between what is planned and what is still unfolding. Because on one hand, Artemis presents itself as a structured program with clear objectives and a defined pathway. On the other, it is constantly adapting, adjusting to new data, new technologies, and shifting conditions. And Artemis 2 sits precisely in that space between definition and adaptation. This is where the idea of control becomes interesting. Not control in a strict sense, but in terms of how much of the future is actually predetermined. It is easy to assume that large programs like this follow a fixed plan, moving from one milestone to the next with clear intention. But in reality, the path is shaped continuously by feedback. Each mission provides information that influences the next. Each decision is made within the context of what has already happened and what is currently possible. This creates a kind of feedback loop, where the program evolves in response to itself. Artemis 2 is part of that loop. It is not just executing a plan, it is contributing to the process of refining that plan. And this means that its impact extends beyond its immediate objectives. If we look at the systems involved, this becomes more apparent. The Orion spacecraft is not just being tested for this mission, it is being evaluated for its role in future missions. The Space Launch System is not just launching a crew, it is demonstrating whether it can serve as a reliable foundation for ongoing exploration. And these evaluations are not binary. They are not simply success or failure. They are nuanced, involving performance margins, operational efficiency, cost considerations, and adaptability. The results feed into decisions that may not be visible immediately, but that shape the trajectory of the program over time. There is also the role of momentum. Once a program reaches a certain stage, once hardware is built, teams are established, and missions are underway, it develops its own inertia. Continuing becomes, in many ways, the path of least resistance. Not because alternatives are impossible, but because changing direction requires overcoming that existing momentum. Artemis 2 contributes to building that momentum. A successful mission reinforces confidence, strengthens partnerships, and justifies continued investment. It makes the next steps feel more certain, even if they are still complex. But momentum can also narrow options. As a system becomes more established, it can become less flexible. Decisions made early on about architecture, technology, and partnerships become embedded in the structure of the program. And this leads to another quiet question. How adaptable is the Artemis framework over the long term? Can it evolve significantly if new opportunities or challenges arise? Or will it tend to follow the path that is already being set? Again, Artemis 2 does not answer this directly, but it plays a role in determining how that adaptability is perceived. A system that performs well under testing is more likely to be maintained. A system that reveals limitations may prompt reconsideration. There is also the broader context of time. Space exploration operates on timescales that extend beyond individual missions, beyond even individual careers. Decisions made today may influence outcomes decades into the future. This adds another layer of complexity because it requires balancing immediate needs with long-term vision. Artemis 2 exists within that balance. It must succeed in the present, but it is also part of a process that extends far beyond its own timeline. If we step back one more time, the pattern becomes clearer. Artemis 2 is not a singular turning point, but it is part of a gradual shift. A movement from exploration as a series of isolated achievements toward exploration as a continuous, evolving system. And within that shift, small details matter. The way systems are integrated, the way missions are paced, the way partnerships are structured. Each of these elements contributes to the overall direction, even if their impact is not immediately obvious. So as Artemis 2 approaches its role in this larger story, it carries with it more than just its mission profile. It carries the accumulated weight of past decisions and the potential influence on future ones. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of all is that this influence is not fixed. It is not predetermined. It is shaped by outcomes, by interpretation, and by the choices that follow. As we continue, we'll begin to bring everything together, not to reach a final conclusion, but to explore what all these patterns, signals, and questions might suggest when viewed as a whole. As we begin to gather everything around Artemis 2 into a single, steady perspective, the feeling is less like arriving at an answer, and more like recognizing a shape that has been forming quietly all along. Because every layer we've explored, the technology, the timelines, the human element, the constraints, the patterns, doesn't point to one hidden conclusion. Instead, it reveals something more subtle, a direction that is still being written in real time. From the mainstream view, nothing here is uncertain in a dramatic sense. Artemis 2 is a crude lunar flyby mission. It tests systems. It prepares for future landings. It fits into a long-term plan that extends towards sustained lunar presence and eventually deeper exploration. That framework holds together logically, and there is no need to replace it with anything more speculative. But when you hold that framework alongside everything else we've examined, it begins to feel less like a fixed roadmap and more like a living structure, something that adapts as it moves forward. And that distinction between a fixed plan and an evolving system is where much of the quiet complexity of Artemis 2 seems to reside. Because if this were simply a repeat of the Apollo program, we might expect a clear endpoint, a defined goal achieved within a relatively short period, followed by a transition to something else. But Artemis does not move in that way. It stretches outward, not toward a single moment, but toward continuity. And continuity changes how everything is evaluated. Success is not just about reaching a destination, but about whether the system can sustain itself, whether it can be repeated, expanded, and integrated into something larger over time. Artemis 2, in this sense, is less about proving that we can go to the moon again, and more about proving that we can begin going back in a way that does not stop. And that introduces a different kind of question. Not, can we do this, but how do we keep doing this? And that question naturally leads into considerations that go beyond the immediate mission. For example, the reliance on systems like the Orion spacecraft, and the Space Launch System reflects current capabilities, but also current constraints. These systems work within a particular model of exploration, one that involves large launches, centralized control, and carefully planned missions. But as exploration continues, will that model remain dominant? Or will it gradually shift towards something more distributed, more flexible, perhaps even more autonomous? Artemis 2 does not resolve that question, but it contributes to how it is approached. A system that performs reliably tends to persist. A system that reveals limitations invites alternatives. And those alternatives may already be developing in parallel, waiting for the right moment to become more central. There is also the matter of scale. What begins as a series of missions can, over time, become something more permanent. Infrastructure, once established, tends to expand. Pathways, once opened, tend to be used again. So if Artemis leads to sustained operations around the Moon, that presence may begin to shape priorities in ways that are difficult to predict fully from the present moment. It could accelerate further exploration, or it could deepen the focus on the lunar environment itself. And here, the pattern we touched on earlier returns. Exploration does not always move outward in a straight line. It expands, stabilizes, and then expands again. Artemis 2 sits at the beginning of one of those expansion phases, but it is also influenced by the stability that follows. Another layer, perhaps the quietest of all, is how all of this is perceived over time. Right now, Artemis 2 is seen as a major step forward, a return to deep space with human presence. But as more missions follow, as the pathway becomes more familiar, that perception will shift. What feels significant now may later feel routine. And that transition, from extraordinary to expected, is often a sign that a new capability has truly been integrated into human activity. So in a way, Artemis 2 is part of that transition. It is helping to move deep space travel from something rare and historic towards something that can happen again and again and again. And when that happens, the nature of exploration changes. It becomes less about reaching and more about being, less about proving and more about operating. If we bring all of this together, the picture that emerges is not one of hidden secrets or dramatic revelations. It is something quieter, but perhaps more meaningful. A process that is unfolding step by step, shaped by decisions, constraints, and opportunities that interact in complex ways. Artemis 2 is one of those steps. It does not define the entire path, but it influences it. It does not answer every question, but it helps refine them. And perhaps the most honest way to understand it is this: not as a mission that reveals everything, but as one that makes the next layer of understanding possible. As we move into the final part, we'll take one last step back and look at the entire picture as a whole, not to close the subject, but to leave it in a place where the questions themselves feel clearer, more grounded, and worth continuing to explore. As we arrive at the final stretch of this quiet exploration around Artemis 2, the most interesting thing is that nothing here truly ends. There's no sharp conclusion waiting at the edge of the discussion, no single revelation that suddenly reframes everything we've looked at. Instead, what settles in is something more subtle, a clearer sense of the pattern, and perhaps a better understanding of where to keep looking. Because if you take everything we've explored, the systems, the timelines, the human element, the constraints, the shifting balance between cooperation and competition, the role of the Moon, and the longer historical cycles, it all points toward one consistent idea. Artemis 2 is not an isolated milestone. It is part of a transition, a slow, deliberate shift in how exploration itself is being approached. From the mainstream perspective, that transition is already defined in simple terms. Return to the moon. Build sustainable systems. Prepare for Mars. And within that framework, Artemis 2 is exactly what it claims to be. A necessary, carefully planned step. A mission that tests, validates, and prepares. And that explanation holds. It fits the evidence. It aligns with what we know. But when you sit with it a little longer and allow all the layers to exist at once, it begins to feel like that explanation is only the surface of something more dynamic. Not hidden, not secret, just unfolding in a way that doesn't fully reveal itself all at once. Because what Artemis 2 is really testing is not just hardware. It is testing a method, a way of doing space exploration that is fundamentally different from what came before. Less about singular achievements like those of the Apollo program, and more about continuity. Less about reaching once, and more about returning repeatedly. And that shift, while subtle, changes everything. It changes how missions are designed. It changes how success is measured. It changes how risk is managed, how timelines are structured, and how partnerships are formed. It even changes how we, as observers, interpret what we are seeing. Because if exploration becomes continuous, then individual missions begin to matter in a different way. They are no longer endpoints. They are inputs, feeding into a system that grows over time. Artemis 2 is one of those inputs. And what makes it particularly interesting is where it sits in the sequence, early enough that many things are still flexible, late enough that the core structure is already forming. It is close to the beginning, but not at the very start, which means its influence is quiet, but real. If it succeeds, as expected, it reinforces the current trajectory. The use of the Orion spacecraft, the reliance on the space launch system, the modular architecture, the collaborative model, all of these become more deeply embedded. If it encounters challenges, those same elements are re-examined, adjusted, refined, not discarded entirely, but reshaped. Either way, the mission contributes to the evolution of the system. And that brings us to perhaps the most grounded, but also most open-ended observation of all. Artemis 2 does not tell us exactly where we are going, but it tells us how we are beginning to go there, and that how may be more important than the destination itself. Because destinations can change, priorities can shift, technologies can evolve in ways that are difficult to predict. But the method, the structure, the approach, the patterns of decision-making tends to persist. So if we understand Artemis 2 as part of establishing that method, then we begin to see its significance in a different light. Not as a dramatic return to the moon, but as a calibration of the system that will carry us further. And within that calibration, the questions we've been asking don't disappear. They become more precise. How flexible is this system over time? How much of it is shaped by current constraints, and how much is designed for future expansion? At what point does continuity become momentum, and momentum become limitation? And perhaps most importantly, how does human presence fit into a system that is becoming increasingly automated, distributed, and complex? These are not questions with immediate answers, and they don't need to be, because part of what makes this moment interesting is that the answers are still forming, shaped by missions like Artemis 2 as they unfold. So instead of closing with a conclusion, it may be more useful to leave this exactly where it naturally settles. Not in certainty, but in clarity. We know what Artemis 2 is meant to do. We understand how it fits into the broader framework, and we can see the patterns beginning to emerge around it. But the full picture, the long-term direction, is still just beyond the edge of what can be clearly defined. And maybe that's exactly where it's supposed to be. Because exploration, at its core, has always been about stepping into that space between what is known and what is still taking shape, and allowing each step to reveal just a little more of the path ahead.